Daniel Weiser, Artistic Director and founder of AmiciMusic. I want to welcome you to another Music and Meaning concert through the Baltimore Hebrew Congregation, a series made possible by a generous donation from the Yale and Peggy Gordon Foundation. Today's program is a live stream. We do hope to get back soon to live concerts there at the congregation, but with the COVID surge, we felt it better to do this as a live stream. We hope you can watch this from your homes. And this is a very powerful concert we're calling In Memory, a musical memorial for the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 tragedy. We're going to play three pieces that have a really sort of emotional impact, all music about grief, about suffering, but also I think about the redemptive quality of music, how it can help us overcome some of the darkness from our tragedies, both personal and communal. We'll begin with Samuel Barber's amazing Adagio for strings, move to a piano trio by Bedrich Smetana, written in 1855, and we'll finish with one of the most powerful pieces in the entire repertoire, Shostakovich's piano trio in E minor, opus 67. This is a draining program emotionally, but I think one that really shows the power of music to get us through some difficult times. And certainly this last year has not been easy, and music has been a great source to many, to myself, to everybody, to get us through. And hopefully we are seeing the light at the end of the tunnel. And I want to thank you for being a part of our Music and Meaning concert. Please enjoy In Memory. The first piece on our program is one that I associate quite directly with the 9/11 tragedy. I can remember it being played almost constantly as we found out more and we watched some of the horrible scenes on television. And that is Samuel Barber's Adagio for strings, which was actually voted recently as the saddest classical piece ever composed, and one that rarely leaves a dry eye. As one reviewer said, it's a piece full of pathos and cathartic passion, and that indeed it is. It was played at many different funerals, played over the radio when FDR died. It was performed by the National Symphony Orchestra soon after the assassination of President Kennedy. It was played at the funeral of Albert Einstein. It was also made famous in the movie Platoon, with lots of that music played during some horrific scenes. So it is a piece that we associate with grief, but also with trying to come to grips with a horrible tragedy, with human suffering. It was written by Samuel Barber, one of our great American composers, born in 1910, dies in 1981, grew up in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and was one of the early students at the New Curtis Institute in Philadelphia, where he got his training as both a composer and as a pianist. He knew pretty early on that he wanted to be a composer. He actually started playing piano when he was 3 or 4 years old, and he wrote his first piece when he was 6 years old. And appropriately, it had the title Sadness. So he always had that sort of melancholic feel about his music. But his parents didn't really want him to be a musician. He actually had an aunt, Louise Homer, who was a contralto with the Metropolitan Opera. His uncle, Sidney Homer, was a composer. But his father was a doctor and really wanted his son to get more involved in sports and probably grow up to be a doctor. And in fact, we have a really funny letter that Barber wrote when he was 9 years old to his mother. And it says the following: "Dear mother, I have written this to tell you my little secret. Now don't cry when you read it, because it is neither your nor my fault. I suppose I will have to tell it to you now without any nonsense. To begin with, I was not meant to be an athlete. I was meant to be a composer, and I will be, I'm sure. I just ask you one more thing. Please don't ever make me play football again." So this was a kid who kind of knew what he wanted. Indeed goes off to Curtis and then begins to travel around the world performing and composing. And with his partner, Giancarlo Menotti, the wonderful opera composer who we met at Curtis, they spent the year of 1936 in Italy. And it's there where he wrote this piece, which actually was originally the slow movement to the string quartet, opus 11. But he loved the music so much that he thought it could work for a larger group, and he wrote it for orchestra, for a larger string orchestra. And it was actually premiered by the great Arturo Toscanini, who didn't often like to do music of American composers. He didn't think there were that many great American composers. But Toscanini supposedly took this piece, and after one rehearsal, he just put his baton down and he said to the orchestra, "Semplice e bella," simple and beautiful. And that it indeed is. Just evokes so much sorrow and grief and a catharsis, which I think really sort of sets the stage so well for this concert. Here is an arrangement we made of Samuel Barber's Adagio for strings. Our next work depicts a more personalized and anguished grief as the result of one of the worst tragedies that could happen to anyone, and that is the death of your child. And in this case, Bedrich Smetana lost 3 daughters in the span of 2 years, and it was the loss of his 4-year-old daughter, Bedriska, who he had really found a bond with. She had begun to love music, and her death in 1855 put Smetana over the edge, and indeed he almost killed himself. But instead, he poured his soul into this amazing piano trio, his Opus 15 in G minor, the first trio he had written, and really the first great work he had written. Smetana was born in 1824, was the son of a beer maker, and in fact, he was supposed to be a brewer, long line in his family, but he didn't want to do that. He didn't have any sort of musical background, any relatives in that, but he was devoted to becoming a musician. Now, there were no great schools of music around Prague where he was living, so he actually started his own school. This was before the Prague Conservatory in 1847. He got married around that time. They really struggled because there were not that many students to go to this school, but they had these wonderful daughters who were born. But in 1853, one of the infants died. The next year, another infant died, and then Bedriska was taken by scarlet fever. And in fact, his wife also got tuberculosis at this time, and she would die a year later. So it was just a terrible time in Smetana's life. And we know from his diaries that he really did contemplate suicide. But instead, he writes this work. We're going to play the first movement and the third movement. And right away in the first movement, you will hear this solo violin sound of just absolute despair as he sort of understands that he doesn't know what to do, that his life is crumbling around him. And then the cello and piano come in and just pounding funereal chords. There is a moment of quietude soon after, a little cello solo that apparently is Bedriska's theme. This was one that she really loved when Smetana would play it for her earlier on. And the movement just sort of goes back and forth between these moments of anguish and then moments of trying to deal with the grief, and finally just catapulting into a final chaotic end that sort of you feel like Smetana smashing the piano in his anger of everything going wrong. And we're going to jump then to the third movement, which starts off with this very fast motion in the piano where I'm playing eighth notes in my right hand and triplets in the left hand, and it really does feel like death is coming. The heartbeat is pushing ahead, and Smetana is doing everything he can to stop the inevitable from happening. And again, this one sort of the transitions back and forth between these beautiful impassioned themes of remembrance and this anguish. There's one writer who wrote this beautifully. He said, this piece is the most convincing expression of inconsolable grief illuminated within by nostalgia. It is the terror of tragedy juxtaposed with the gracious nobility of what it destroyed. And what is so powerful about the end of this movement, we get this sort of a chorale-like theme, and finally a true funeral march when we really realize that Bedriska has gone, that there seems like there's no hope. And then at that moment, when everything seems so dark, there's a little rumbling in the piano, and then the scales starting from the bottom of the piano all the way to the top, and we finish suddenly in G major, and it's as if Smetana has said, no. My job is to keep going, to write this piece of music, to reveal the power of music, to overcome my grief, to give it some hope. There's a little brief moment at the end where, again, it goes back to the minor, so we're never really fully out. As we know, grief works. But I do think that there's some sense of hope at the end of this as Smetana sort of comes to grips with his great loss and sees music as a way out. Here is Bedrich Smetana's first movement and third movement of his piano trio in G minor, Opus 15. Our final piece is one of the most powerfully emotional pieces, I think, in the entire repertoire. It is the Shostakovich Piano Trio No. 2 in E minor, written in 1944 during World War II, as Shostakovich heard more and more reports about the death camps and the Holocaust. This was a piece that I actually performed soon after the 9/11 tragedy, and I can remember finishing this work and the utter silence in the audience, which is not always a great feeling as a musician, but in this case, really sort of felt like the only response as people sort of took in the horrors of 9/11 and also remembered the Holocaust. Shostakovich was not Jewish, but he did have a couple of really important Jewish friends that this music sort of evokes in many ways. One of them was a student of his, Fleischmann, Victor Fleischmann, who had started work on an opera called Rothschild's Violin, which contained some Hasidic tunes, some klezmer tunes in it. Shostakovich really loved this piece, but Fleischmann had gone off to fight in the war and had died at the siege of Leningrad. Shostakovich felt it was his calling to finish this piece in 1944. And so he became imbued with a lot of these Jewish folk songs that were in that music. At the same time, he had a wonderful friend and a mentor, Ivan Solortinsky, who died in 1944 of a heart attack. He was an incredible man, was a music critic, professor of Romance languages, spoke 26 languages supposedly, and really encouraged Shostakovich in his musical writing. And it was his death that really sort of was the first spur upon him writing this piece. When he found out about it, he wrote to Solortinsky's widow, "It is impossible for me to express in words all the grief that engulfed me upon hearing the news about Ivan Ivanovich's death. He was my closest and dearest friend. To live without him will be unbearably difficult." And so he embarks upon this work. I think at first starts off as a more personal tragedy, but again, it expands to the whole of humanity as we move, especially into the final movement, which is filled with all sorts of klezmer tunes in contrast to some of the marching military music, as well as the two sides kind of fight back and forth. There is just some horror in this music, but also this Jewish music is so quintessentially there. And this is how Shostakovich wrote about Jewish music. He said, "Jewish folk music has made a most powerful impression upon me. I never tire of delighting in it. It's multifaceted. It can appear to be happy while it is tragic. It's almost always laughter through tears. This quality of Jewish folk music is close to my ideas of what music should be. Jews became a symbol for me. All of man's defenselessness was concentrated in them. After the war, I tried to convey that feeling in my music. It was a bad time for Jews then. In fact, it's always a bad time for Jews." And Shostakovich wrote these pieces with Jewish themes at his own peril. This was not something that the Soviet government believed in, and he got in big trouble at different times with the communist authorities. And in fact, he always kept a bag packed outside by the stairs so that he was waiting for his arrest at night out on the landing so that his family would not be disturbed. But he did not get arrested. He would sort of go back and forth and write music that sort of towed the line more. But these pieces with Jewish themes were clearly much more emotionally attached to Shostakovich's own being. We start off with this first movement in which the cello plays these artificial harmonics. It has a rather ghostly sound way up high. And then the violin comes in lower than the cello. It's as if the whole world has been turned upside down. The violin should always be higher than the cello. Then the piano comes in first very low in the piano, but ultimately I do a lot of my playing in this movement with my hands spread far apart, one very high in the register, one very low, and it's as if there's no middle ground upon which to stand. The movement sort of gains energy slowly and slowly with, again, a couple little folk songs in it, and then sort of dies away peacefully at the end. The second movement has a kind of grotesque circus-like quality to it. In fact, Solortinsky's sister thought that this movement sort of perfectly depicted Solortinsky, who would sort of go from one topic to the next, back and forth. He said, that movement is his temper, his manner of speech, his habit of returning to one and the same thought and then developing it. And there's sort of these two different themes that war against each other, and then a kind of like circus theme that is done over this really fast stuff going on. Just an exciting rush to the end of that movement. The third movement is an incredible lament. Starts with these 8 pounding chords in the piano, and those 8 chords actually just repeat themselves constantly through the movement, while the violin and the cello play this kind of dialogue of lament and sorrow with a very Jewish-sounding theme to it above. And that movement segues directly into the last movement, which again begins with this pizzicato violin, klezmer dance kind of motive, but then the cello comes in with these more anguished sounds, and those two go back and forth until there's sort of this clash almost towards the end, a big smashing chord in the piano, and then it's as if the souls of all of the dead have been are rising up over these kind of fast notes as we play, and the return of the theme from the first movement. And then very much towards the end, there's a really dark side when he writes for the string instruments to play col legno, which means on the back of the bow, and it really sounds like bones rattling. And Shostakovich had heard about some of the Nazi guards making the prisoners dance to their death, and it really feels that this is a dance of death. And at the very end, there are these sort of E major chords, much like in Smetana. There's a little lightness that comes in there, but we're really not sure if there is any hope for humanity or not. I leave that for you to decide. It's a very chilling but just an incredibly emotional work. Shostakovich Piano Trio, Opus 67. Hope you enjoy. Thank you for being part of another Music and Meaning concert through the Baltimore Hebrew Congregation, again made possible with a generous grant from the Peggy and Yale Gordon Foundation. I want to thank everybody at Baltimore Hebrew Congregation for their continued support and enthusiasm for these programs. If you would like to find out more about AmiciMusic, the address is below, AmiciMusic.org. We do concerts all through the year in various places. And also I teach some classes on various composers, both in person and on Zoom right now. So please check us out there. We are hoping to be back in person for our next concert, which will be a Halloween concert special of spooky music, which we're hoping to make. We're not quite sure it's going to happen, but we think it will. So stay tuned for more information about that. And again, thank you for being a part of our In Memory concert. And we wish you all a very safe and healthy remainder to 2021. Take care.